I deem him one of the greatest beings alive in our time.
What is your name?
My name is for my friends.
None of my friends is a murderer.
Nous disons qu'il y a une minorité qui s'impose par la terreur et la violence. Nous sommes arrivés à la moyenne de 4,2 attentats par jour.
They're going to get it, Mr. Bentley. I'm going to give it to them.
No man of our time has drawn upon himself so much praise and so much criticism.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sleazoids, the podcast where we go down the rabbit hole of 20th century genre fare from the most influential canon classics to the trashiest exploitation films we can get our hands on, and invite you to tag along in helping us create a canon of sleaze. Each week is a double feature grindhouse style where we discuss two films loosely related by subject, genre, actor, filmmaker, or franchise, and at the end of each episode, along with our honorary Sleazoids, which you can become by subscribing on Patreon, we decide on the official ratings and rankings for every film that we cover. Patreon subscribers also get an on-air shout-out and 2 bonus episodes every single month, which we've been doing for 6 or 7 months now.
Yeah,
so
there's got to be like 12 episodes.
Yeah,
or something
more.
Like that.
I think there's like 15 maybe. So there's a lot of bonus episodes with lots of movies, literally like 30 movies.
Hours of content, guys.
Yeah, waiting for you back there. So if you haven't made the jump, consider doing that. And also, anyone listening to us on Stitcher, iTunes, wherever you're listening to us, give us a good old rating and review if you've been enjoying the show. That helps us climb the ranks and find new listeners. So that's very helpful. But anyway, that's the plugs for the week.
Right.
Now, 2 weeks ago would have been the last time you guys, free listeners, everyone would have heard from us. And we would have been talking Predator.
Oh, yeah.
1987. In conjunction with
Unbelievably good.
Shane Black's sort of quasi-sequel that he released this year, which is really bad.
I heard you didn't like it. Yeah.
I was at the Toronto International Film Festival, and I made the dumb decision to, for some reason, watch that movie while I was there. And I was like,
but granted, you thought like you probably were gonna like it.
I
right?
was anticipating. I love Shane Black. I anticipated really enjoying
At least
it. The Nice Guys, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. Excellent
right, I love
films.
those movies. So.
You couldn't tell this was a Shane Black movie. It was a
That's a shame.
It was a Marvel movie with a little bit of blood in it.
That's what I heard. Yeah. I heard it's just like Quip Town. It's just quippiness and like there's no real moments. Like I heard that they don't even show fear.
And
really,
it's studio hacked to garbage. They turned it.
Oh, wow.
There's nothing to do with horror. It's entirely like ragtag adventure comedy. Like watch these misfits get together like Guardians of the Galaxy style and overcome the creature. Like that's the movie.
Oh, okay.
It's pretty bad. But Predator, on the other hand, which we did talk about,
is fucking amazing.
Is amazing. John McTiernan's Predator is amazing, and we had the two dudes from the Podfast Pod Furious podcast.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
On to talk about that film alongside Walter Hill's Southern Comfort, his sort of Louisiana swamp take on the Vietnam War film, which was a lot of fun. So that would have been last time everyone heard from us. But last week, patrons, all of you out there in patron land, would have heard us talking about the late, great Burt Reynolds.
Yes.
We talked White Lightning, 1973, and the follow-up directed by Burt Reynolds himself, Gator, 1976.
And at the time, we didn't really know he was going to pass.
And again, when I went to the Toronto International Film Festival, I had to leave Jamie for 2 weeks, so we recorded tons of episodes in advance, including the one about Burt Reynolds, and he happened to pass away the week after we recorded. So everyone who heard that episode, we're really sorry, but
so if there were any mean jokes
about Burt Reynolds, we take them all back.
Yeah, exactly, all of them. We're sorry. We apologize.
Yeah.
We put it on the record.
So anyway, if you want that episode again, that's patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. That was last week's episode. But this week...
R.I.P. Bert.
R.I.P. This week, we are branching out a little bit. We're bending the rules a tiny bit.
Yeah.
Because we had an awesome guest we wanted to bring on, someone who's very interested in world history and even has his own podcast about history. Mm-hmm. So we were like, we want to have him on and we want to talk historical films, which are films that Jamie and I both really enjoy.
Yeah.
But we were like, man, most historical films out there aren't generally horror or action.
No.
So we went a little bit more...
Not the sleaziest of the genres.
Exactly. We went a little bit more prestige-y this week, but they do actually kind of work together and have their own sort of genre element to them in a way.
Yeah.
But that guest is Everett, also known on Twitter as Trillburn of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Everett, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Now, Everett, which two films have you paired together, and why have you brought them with you?
The first film is Lawrence of Arabia. That's 1962, directed by David Lean, and starring a million people. Peter O'Toole is the title role. The second film is The Battle of Algiers, which is 1966, directed by Gilo Pontecorvo, and not really starring anyone in particular.
No, that was filled with non-professional actors, that one.
Yeah. Which really, I mean, we'll get to it, but makes it kind of
it works.
Even more realistic and more gritty. Yeah, I enjoyed that part of it.
And the reason I chose these two films, so they have a lot of sort of surface similarities. They're both about popular uprisings in the Middle East. They were shot very near each other in time, but they're very different films and have a very different approach to the subject.
Yes, because these are both sort of political revolution and resistance films, specifically under colonial oppression by Middle Eastern countries. And the two filmmakers have a very starkly different visual sense for what that feels like and what that means.
Absolutely, yes.
But with that being said, I mean, I guess we'll jump into it. Lawrence of Arabia?
Yeah, let's do it.
Now, a gathering of international stars unfolds the story. Alec Guinness as Prince Faisal.
The English have a great hunger for desolate places. I fear they hunger for Arabia.
Anthony Quinn as Auda Abu Taihi.
I carry 23 great wounds, all got in battle. 75 men have I killed with my own hands in battle. I scatter, I burn my enemies' tents. I take away their flocks and herds. The Turks pay me a golden treasure, yet I am poor, because I am a river to my people.
Jack Hawkins as General Allenby.
I believe your name will be a household word when you would have to go to the War Museum to find who Allenby was. You're the most extraordinary man I ever met.
Leave me alone.
What?
Leave me alone.
Jose Ferrer as the Turkish Bey.
Your skin is very fair.
Also starring Anthony Quayle, Claude Rains, Arthur Kennedy, with Omar Sharif as Ali, and Peter O'Toole as Lawrence.
All right, we are talking Lawrence of Arabia, the 1962 historical epic directed by one of the kings of, I guess, big budget epic films back in the day, David Lean. Bridge on the River Kwai. What else did he do? Dr. Zhivago.
Third Man.
Yeah.
Yeah, so lots of great stuff in there. This film kind of followed up a series of big classic historical epic style films, things like Ben-Hur, things like The Ten Commandments.
Minimum of 4 hours.
Exactly, but David Lean, I think, very much specialized in how to make something that big kind of feel personal and feel intimate in a way that I think people did not anticipate for a film that was 4 hours long and had the budget that it had.
Yeah.
That would be more interested in spectacle than
Yeah.
it would be in character.
And also something like just the what it's based on as well. Like, it's not like The Godfather, right? We're not watching mobsters or anything like that. But, you know, it could, like, you say, oh, it's a 3.5 hour historical film. You're like, oh, damn.
Either way, what ended up happening
But it's great.
was that he inspired an entire generation of filmmakers and basically defined spectacle filmmaking for what year is it? To now.
Yeah, exactly.
Spectacle filmmaking was kind of changed forever by Lawrence of Arabia and its gorgeous 70mm photography. And largely it tells the story of a British officer in World War I named T.E. Lawrence, who aids a series of Arab tribes in their revolt against the Ottoman Empire, which I suppose would be the Turks. Right, Everett? They mostly call them the Turks, so I assume that's what the Ottoman Empire was. This is how badly researched I am. This is going to be embarrassing.
We aren't the history majors here.
But on his journey, Lawrence kind of becomes a bit of a messianic figure in the cause for revolution against the Turks, but also is very susceptible to both the manipulation of the British Empire, who has kind of other means for the Arab revolt, and also begins to sort of undermine his own psychology at the same time, and grows increasingly unstable as the film goes on, and it threatens to kind of undermine all of the work that he's aided in.
And he starts to kind of create this almost god complex within himself, it seems.
A little megalomaniacal.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're like we'll of course get to it, but there's a moment where he does something that helps them a very significant amount, and they start like cheering his name, and you can tell he's really taking that in and really eating it up.
He's got an ego for sure.
Absolutely.
Now, Everett, we're going to ask you right off the bat, before we kind of jump into a more beat by beat, we're going to go into some of the major moments and beats of Lawrence of Arabia. But if you had to kind of briefly get us into it, how accurate to T.E. Lawrence is David Lean and screenwriter, I believe, Robert Bolt?
Well, if anything, it's hard to believe after watching this. If anything, they undersell what a strange character Lawrence was.
Wow.
He was a deeply eccentric person, and who's been, I mean, that's part of why he's fascinated people for so long, is because he's hard to unravel. He's not the kind of person you would picture being a great conqueror and leading these kind of hardened nomads. He was a very kind of feminine. He was this very cultured British gentleman.
Yeah, Lean kind of gets into that a little bit in the early scenes with him there, where O'Toole kind of does play him a little bit more flamboyant than you would expect for a military figure. Mm-hmm. And even the other sort of people that are part of the British Empire are kind of, they call him a clown. And they're just and for the most part, they give him this job just so they don't have to look at him or talk to him because he's just sitting around kind of like saying funny things, and they're like, just go away, go do something over there, which kicks off his whole mission.
I mean, it's hard to picture for us now, but like that was a definite type in that like late British Empire world, like the eccentric officer with kind of a mystical bent and like maybe a little too fascinated by the people that they're colonizing. So, you know, for his time, he was just kind of an extreme example of this type that was out there. But looking back now, I mean, like the American Empire does not have guys like that. Certainly not running things anyway.
Right.
And I guess with the other historical context stuff, I mean, it's just, you know, I think they actually do a very good job in the film of sort of very briefly filling you in that there's, you know, the Ottoman Empire was this collapsing, gigantic, multi-ethnic state, and the British and French were very keen to get in there and, you know, topple them, kicking in the rotting door, so to speak, and then, you know, bring in their own influence. And the big question was, and the big question in the film is the Arab revolt going to be a part of that, or is it going to somehow germinate into its own thing outside of the British influence?
Right, which is obviously what they don't want. And it's very interesting to see because the film uniquely kind of, for being a film that's considered sort of a character study and kind of deeply personal to the character of T. Lawrence, the film often kind of breaks from his point of view to like a larger, more distant point of view to show the fact that while we're getting swept up in, you know, Lawrence's escapades and all of his successes, we're seeing how that is being manipulated both by Prince Faisal, who he is the leader of the tribe, who he is helping, played by an unfortunate Alec Guinness in brownface, which is, I will say, it's a little distracting to watch and a little questionable even watching it now, only because obviously people people would shout in the streets if that happened.
Yeah, at that point,
that doesn't
right.
fly anymore. So it makes sense watching it now because you're kind of like, man, that it's unfortunate to watch. And then doubly beside Omar Sharif, who plays Sheriff Ali, who was the one sort of like Middle Eastern heritage actor that they did have.
Right.
And he's amazing.
Yeah.
So you're just like, you couldn't find another one. They must have just wanted a star.
Yeah, I looked at a few of the casting after just to see,
who was doing it and who wasn't.
was actually, yeah, exactly. And I mean, I was pleasantly surprised to see that there was actually quite a few, which was great. But it's just, I guess they were like, we need the lead, one of the other leads to be the Hollywood guy, I guess. That's what they
Alec
were doing,
Guinness, who I mean would have been an Oscar darling around that time. I mean, he probably was nominated for the role regardless. But yeah, so he's kind of being manipulated on the Arab side by Prince Faisal, who clearly is trying to do what is best for his tribes and his people, and he's trying to maintain power and use this collapsing Ottoman Empire to his advantage to, challenge the British Empire in some capacity, while the British Empire is trying to use the exact same successes that Lawrence is having to challenge the same territory. It's basically two different groups fighting over the same territory, but the British has a lot more power, a lot more control, and wants even a lot worse things for largely the Arab people.
Right, like even after they were liberated, it seems like they'd still want the control of them. They mentioned things like they didn't like the guerrilla tactics and would rather them getting to training so that they can become more disciplined, in their minds, like the British army and things like that.
Right, and Lean kind of captures this by doing these brilliant, amazing desert vistas. And this gorgeous 70 millimeter photography of the desert. It basically inspired both Spielberg's fascination with the desert and Lucas's fascination with the desert.
Yeah,
Star Wars and things like Raiders would have came out of these images.
And I think even like the score, kind of. I don't know if it was a similar thing was done prior, but the score every time I listen to something where it's even Uncharted, for instance. Okay. Uncharted 3 at the end has a very large desert area, and the score is very reminiscent of the score that's in Lawrence of Arabia. So I mean, this has influenced things.
It's a very mystical kind of thing. It's like you're looking at the desert and you're not seeing something desolate like you would see how George Miller uses it in his Mad Max films, for example, where it's something dead, something empty, something decaying. The desert here is more like potential. It's beautiful.
Yeah, there's a mystery.
Like Lawrence is obsessed with it. The filmmaking kind of gets at why he would be obsessed with it. Like the way that the sand moves and stuff. It's like a living, breathing thing, and it sets the stakes for this is something that everyone is fighting over. That this is valuable land, and that this is what all three empires are fighting over.
In his personality, the desert is it's like you were saying, it's blank. It's like a canvas for him to sort of play out this role that he's sometimes unwillingly seems to be kind of fated to play as this kind of quasi mystical conqueror figure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a great scene kind of early on when he's first going into the desert. Actually, I think we should do the opening scene real quick.
Oh, just when he
dies. This movie opens with Lawrence dying,
which was the most shocking part of the film for me because I haven't seen it prior to this, and I just thought it'd be a timeline kind of thing,
right?
And to show his character through his death prior to the entire story was amazing. I thought that was such a good choice.
And he kind of gets a point of view bit where what's the place where they're burying him? I'm assuming it's a British church where they bury
I can't remember.
I think that's St. Paul's Cathedral. I'm not positive though.
Okay. But either way, it's a church where they're burying like important historical and political figures, and that's where Lawrence is being buried, and everyone's kind of talking about him being like, did you know him? Did he deserve a place here? And
what was kind of funny too was the timing of how they switch from the goggles that are dangling from the tree to just his statue, like his head statue, and then the dates of his death. I was David it was Lean, almost played for comedy in a little way. Like it was odd, but it worked really well.
David Lean transitions are very iconic because he kind of he says a lot with a simple cut, and that's kind of what he got really, really well known for. Was he'd show you one image and he would hard cut to another image. and you would kind of have to, you would feel something, or you would associate something with those two distinct images. And I mean, super famously, the one of the match cutting to the desert. That's one of the most famous cuts in film history. Which apparently he talked about with his editor, that they originally had a fade set up, and that they couldn't get it to work, and eventually she accidentally, his editor, just accidentally hard cut it, and then they watched it and they were like, "Stop!"
That's it.
That's amazing.
That's the magic.
Yeah, exactly. And
that's awesome.
And early on with that scene with the match, for example, they're setting up Lawrence as this very strange figure. We kind of mentioned that he's kind of a little bit flamboyant, but he's also depicted as kind of a masochist who really loves
on the edge
burning his fingers on the matches. And they have the line about where he's just like, the trick is not minding that it hurts when the guy asks him, "How do you? It hurts. How do you do that?"
Which is a really cool line to have when we go like 2.5 hours later into the film, and he's being tortured, and he's like keeping the straight face for a little while, and the guy's even looking at him like, "Dude, is this not doing anything for you?" And then eventually he breaks, but it was very cool to have that moment, and then it all come full circle in that scene.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of that, a lot of echoing images, echoing plot beats that are some of the most important in the film, especially when he's told very early on before he's left that the desert is a burning, fiery furnace and not meant for ordinary men. And he's just like, well, I'm going to have fun anyway. I'm no ordinary man, so we'll see how it goes. But what's awesome is when he's first in the desert, and we get all these great vistas of the desert, we're drinking it up. He has a Turkish guide, I believe, of who's kind of guiding him through, and you can see him immediately trying to like kind of. He's putting on a bit of a show for playing the role of what he thinks he's supposed to be doing, which is this guy who's coming to help. Yeah, he gives the guy his gun, and he's eating his food, and he's loving it.
Very charming. Yeah,
he's kind of over exaggerating how much he cares about his guide and how much he cares about the work that he's doing. When all that he's been told, even by his superiors, is you're gonna go and you're gonna measure the situation. Yeah, and that's it. He knows nothing else about what's happening.
They have that moment where they're talking about him and in the old country or whatever, Britain, and he's just like, everybody's fat back there, and then the guy's like, "You're not," and he's like, "Well, I'm not like other men." Like he has such a confidence.
He's kind of tuning his own horn like before he's even had any accomplishments.
Yeah, exactly.
And he immediately kind of gets woken up by the fact that one of the best character introductions of all time, Omar Sharif, just a little tiny fly on the horizon of the desert. Yeah. And he's slowly approaching. Like,
what's going on?
And you're like, what's going on here? And
quickly escalates.
Yeah, Omar Sharif kills the Turkish man for drinking out of a And he says that guy basically, diminishes him as a person. Basically says that guy I don't consider him on a human level. He doesn't deserve the decency of some of my water.
Which is really shocking after you spend a good 20 minutes with this guy and
he seems
Lawrence
likable.
becomes become friends.
Yeah,
and,
Lawrence is
and
like,
Lawrence
he's my friend.
says he's my friend. Like, what are you doing, dude? Like, and
Lawrence has something.
Well, that's a classic thing in movies like this. Is there's like the guy, the Westerner going into the foreign place, and there's always kind of like the guy who's his native guide and becomes his friend and guides him. And this movie introduces that character and then just shoots him.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, well, because he's like, look, this place isn't going to be what you think it is, as much as you want it to be, and as much as he's envisioned it a certain way, and wanting to have it bow to what he thinks are his own standards of operation. I was like, that's not what's happening here. Yeah. And he gets woken up to that fact very, very quickly in this film, which is just interesting because normally that would be the end of another movie, where someone goes the whole movie thinking that way. But this is like the first, half hour, 40 minutes of the film.
Yeah, I almost feel like he's resentful towards him as well because he spent all this time putting on his charm and convincing him like he had the person that was already not looking up to him necessarily, but really appreciated him and respected him, and now he has to deal with this new guy who just shot that guy dead, and he has no idea what's in store for him next.
Yeah, and then the guy asks him for his name, and he's like, "My name is for friends,
yeah,
and none
exactly.
of my friends are murderers," which is a very important line
right.
when Lawrence becomes a murderer
yeah.
very, very quickly over the course of this film.
Not to mention, I'm sure some of his friends in the British Army have killed people.
Yeah,
so it's
exactly. Well, Omar
maybe he doesn't picture that as murder, I guess.
Yeah,
That's
Sheriff Ali has a great sort of like counter line to that. He was saying that guy was nothing. He's like, the well is everything, which is he's pointing out that you don't understand. This is a battle for resources, and it needs to happen fast.
Yeah,
and we can't lose this battle.
Right.
Which is, as someone who's there and who doesn't see the larger plan of the British Empire, they're fighting for those exact same resources.
Yeah.
Which is something we sort of get exposed to as the film kind of goes on. But we get lots of great scenes of Lawrence by himself. At one point, he's sort of like he's singing into the desert, and it's like echoing. The mountains are kind of like echoing at him and stuff like that. Because again, he sees it as a way to sort of express himself almost. But quickly, one of the guys who's already there, I forget the character name, but there's a British... Bryden, that's who he is? Yeah, there's a British serving officer already there working with Prince Faisal. And he kind of tells him, look, no matter what happens in there, whatever conversation we have with them, keep in mind that you are a British serving officer. A thing that Lawrence very quickly doesn't do.
No.
And basically suffers the consequences for not doing for the rest of the film, because he genuinely does get invested in Arab interests, which as much as the British say over and over again and insist that British interests are Arab interests, we know that not to be true.
Yeah. Well, they seem pretty upset that he keeps doing things for them and not in mind of them.
And then they're happy about it
British,
simply because he is helping conquer the Turks.
Right.
But at the same time,
he's doing just enough.
Yeah, he's having enough success at removing the Turks out of their way that they're happy with him, but they also think that they can maintain what control they have over the Arab unity, that he is a collective.
Right. And they're worried, I think the more that he frees them, he's also freeing them from the British hand that they have on them.
Yeah,
as well.
So that's what they think.
I think the only person in the whole movie who actually believes that line that British interests and Arab interests are the same is Lawrence in like the first 40 minutes.
Yeah.
No one else in the movie buys that for a second.
For sure.
Yeah, and you even see it when he gets into conversations like with some of his superiors. There's one of my favorite scenes in the film actually is one where we kind of bypass a lot of the He's already conquered. He conquered Aqaba. That's what he's done. That's his big success. He did it. He went through the big desert that nobody could ever cross, that they said everyone dies in. He did something no one expected, and he conquered a Turkish battle point that no one thought possible. And he kind of returns back to the British, and he's having a sit down, and he's got his new sort of like his outfit, his shawls that he's been gifted for doing such an amazing military effort. And while he's there, clearly it has traumatized him a little bit to be on the front lines of a war that he didn't intend to be part of. Again, he was supposed to just measure the situation, and then all of a sudden he's conquering. So when he comes back, he's like, I don't know if I can like really do this anymore. And the British are so impressed that they don't even they don't care about him on any kind of psychological level. They're just like, damn, he removed a big headache for us. So all they do is pump up his ego a little bit. They just go, dude, you did such a good job. We need you. You're great. You're awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, I guess I'll keep going. And he goes right back in.
Love the love, baby.
Meanwhile, he's just been like completely horrified, and he's had that iconic moment, the "Who are you?" scene, where at the end of his big conquering moment, he kind of crosses over some hills and gets his way over to the British Empire. Which where are they situated at that point in the story? Like
Egypt,
Cairo. That's right.
Cairo.
Yeah, so he gets over to Cairo, and someone's like, who are you? And then there's this big shot looking at him with his wide eyes, and he's like, shit, who am I?
That's one of the most interesting things about Lawrence, too, is like it seems like he questions the things that he does do, but all it takes is one person to say, that was a good job. Good for you. You're doing well. And he's like, oh, okay. Like that. It doesn't seem like he requires second thought after somebody else approves it for him. You know what I mean? Like,
because that's, he spells it out, when he says he killed a guy and it bothered me. And the general presses him on what bothered him about it. And he says, I liked it. Right. And so that's what traumatized him. He's not like a normal soldier where, I saw so many guys get killed and it was horrific and it made me feel mortal. What has traumatized him is that he realizes that he's got this part of him that loves killing and conquering and is pretty barbaric. And so, it's a problem for him because, like you said, all it takes is one person pumping him up and going back to feeding that conquering instinct, and he's right back in the saddle.
Yeah, and he's going to be killing people, which is kind of his big thing. And there's a moment too that's really, really powerful where while they're crossing the desert, which is an amazing sequence, which is just, it's multiple days of them crossing the desert, and I've never seen the same desert look so different from shot to shot. Like at night, and it's just completely
gorgeous. To make
a
desolate desert this interesting to look at for 3.5 hours is such an accomplishment.
And it's the same stretch of desert for a majority of it. Because again, it's like a whole 30-minute sequence where he is on one side of the desert trying to be like, we can go attack Aqaba from the opposite side where the Turks won't be expecting us. And they were like, well, yeah, but there's no water in that desert, which is why you can't cross it, because you need to rush it quickly in 10, 12 days or whatever, else you're just gonna die. And they do that. But Lawrence does this big thing that kind of like wins everyone over, which is someone in the night while everyone was asleep fell off his camel. And he rushes back because he's like, I'm going to go save that person, even though it's probably going to mean that I'm going to die. I'm going to go back and save that guy and bring him back. And he does. And it's what really kind of wins everyone over and impresses everyone, and gets to that great moment when he first gets the shawls and the knife. He's holding the knife upside down, and he's like a giggling little child. Playing dress up. He's so pleased with himself in that moment.
Another great moment with those robes is when he does return to the British the headquarters or whatever it is, and they're all looking at him, and he has this moment where he like flips his robe up and then starts walking, and you can tell that the British people are just
like with dignity.
Exactly, just poised, and you can tell that the British people have just never seen this before ever.
They're so confused,
right? They're surrounded by
officers' uniforms and stuff.
Exactly,
right?
So they're just not used to this British guy in these robes, and it was a great little moment for sure.
Yeah.
Now, do you think?
Well, it mirrors the beginning where he he stands out because he's like, he doesn't salute right. He's kind of like mincing around, and he's just, everyone's staring at him. And then when he comes back, an hour and a half later in the film, everyone is staring at him still, but they're like in awe. And he's still a weirdo, and he's still an outsider, but because of what he's done, it's totally transformed. Now he's someone above everyone else, not someone below everyone else.
Yeah, he's almost become like a living myth in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. But after that kind of desert sequence where he saves that guy, one of the biggest moments in the film for me is when there are two conflicting tribes when they take Aqaba. And at one point in the night,
this is where the guy that has the son, correct?
A fight breaks out.
Right.
And someone ends up dead. And basically, it's going to be an all-out war between the two tribes if this isn't settled by like a third-party person, because they don't want one of theirs being killed, but the other people don't want the death on their side being sort of in vain. They want the person punished. So Lawrence steps in and is like, I will be the executor of the punishment, so that both sides can know that this was a fair, reasonable judgment and can go back to working together instead of sort of like ruining this collective before it's even gotten started. And he goes up to execute the man who did murder him, and it's the guy he fucking saved.
Yeah. How much heavier do you get there?
and he's,
well, something I love about that scene. So there's all these, you guys already touched on it. The the kind of God complex. There's a lot of references to that. But who has power over life and death? Yep. God. And Lawrence saved this guy, gave him life, and then he killed him.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I think that's kind of the beginning of when the God complex starts, going into overdrive is that killing that guy.
Yeah, well, because he kind of realizes the power that he has, and the fact that they let him do it. Everyone respected him enough to let him be the arbiter of life and death in that situation.
Do you also, just speaking briefly back on that, when he saves this gentleman, do you think that I almost have this vibe now talking about his character that he does these things even when it comes to risking his own life to save someone. I don't know if it was a purely selfless act anymore. I almost feel like he does it for the recognition in some small way.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like even something as dangerous as solely going back for this one person.
Well, because what does he even say before he leaves?
Which because
the guy's like, because he's like you're literally just killing yourself is what he tells him, and he's just like, well, I'm no ordinary man, or something along the lines of like he defies the laws that his body, like biology, he defies just biology basically is what he suggests when he does it.
It ties into his masochism as well. I mean, because he's got this hero martyr thing. And so the suffering that he undertakes when he does these impossible things that's part of the pleasure for him. That's pretty creepy.
It is very creepy. And what's really fascinating about it is that he is successful. Is kind of the thing, is that really someone who has this kind of drive, who has this kind of God complex in that way, it kind of makes you rethink the people of history that you are aware of. Because you're watching this guy and you're just like, what Lean kind of gets at is that this dude is deeply troubled, and he was only able to make his great accomplishments because he was so fucked up.
Even at the end of his life, what takes him is just pushing himself to the limits that he like. He probably felt like he's like, I can do this, whatever. And then next thing you know, he's off the road hitting trees. So,
absolutely.
And they almost tell you
that
this
God till the day he died.
They almost explain explicitly. There's that scene in the second half of the film when Auda, Anthony Quinn, says to him, the British are making fun of him because he's going home with his loot, and he says, "Hey, you'll all go home too when you get what you want from this place." And when does Lawrence go home? When does he say he wants to go home? It's when he gets tortured and completely destroyed as a person in that Turkish general's quarters. And so he's finally achieved his kind of self-destruction, for the cause, and that's what he came for, and that's when he wants to go home.
Right. Now, I've heard in real life that torture was a bit more explicit than what we see in the film here.
Oh, so it's even worse in real life?
That's what we've heard.
It's also ambiguous in real life.
Oh, it's ambiguous.
Part of the problem is, because it's pretty strongly implied there's some sort of sexual element to what's going on there.
Yeah.
It could be that they just beat him and tortured him and were getting their jollies off of it. Could be that something else happened. That actually is it's not quite as ambiguous, but highly ambiguous in his memoir, and is debated still today by people who study this stuff. They actually think the movie does a very good job of depicting that of like,
we don't know.
They don't tell you what happened, but they kind of suggest kind of what realm we're in pretty explicitly without going out and saying it.
Right. Yeah. So that now the one big history sort of exaggeration I've heard anyway, just by reading, was the Aqaba sequence, which was them literally, I mean, it's a very amazingly filmic sequence, the sequence of them sort of conquering the city with Lawrence on like the front lines, and like there's this amazing giant sweeping pan of them taking it, where you see this giant wide shot of all of the camels and the horses kind of going into the town, and then it pans over the city while they infiltrate sort of every part of the city, and then we wind up with this big foregrounded shot of the cannon facing the water,
right?
Which is
that's actually I think that sequence is based on a different battle, the Battle of Beersheba, where the Australian light horse did that. Basically, just hey, they can, we think we're close enough that we can do a cavalry charge without us all dying, and they pulled it off. There's actually a movie about that called The Light Horseman, but cool. not as well shot because they didn't have as many extras.
Yeah, there's an amazing amount of extras here, and again, it's just a couple minute long sweep where you just watch all of these people literally conquer Aqaba, which is just wild. And then again,
it's so cool though. I mean, this is what I love about like these big historical epic films. I mean, that is division of the Jordanian army, because where else do you get 10,000 men who can, have logistics out in the desert? So the king of Jordan just lent them a division of his army to film some of those really big sequences.
Yeah,
and it really is stunning to watch.
It's just for one shot. That's immediately
no
followed.
CGI, no tricks. It's just that's what it looks like when there's 10,000 guys on horseback. Just pedal to the metal. It is even, I think, even today, pretty breathtaking to watch.
Oh, it is. And it's immediately
there's so
followed.
much weight when they actually use real extras. You feel it. That was probably my favorite part of watching these two films, was just seeing all these real people on screen.
Yeah, well, and then it's awesome because he finishes that shot of the gun where the pan ends up going to the giant cannon, and then he immediately does one of his textbook transitions that he does with a hard cut to like a sunset, which again, these gorgeous shots of the sun and the sky and the water, very elemental, and would go on to inspire all kinds of spectacle films. It's hard to watch this because again, Jamie and I would have both been watching this for the first time, which is a travesty, but
but it's done now.
It's amazing to watch it now and see just how many movies stole from this.
Yeah,
and how powerful it still is to watch it, even though you've seen a lot of the images before.
One of my favorite things, briefly touching on how kind of the British were acting at the end of the film, kind of when it sounds like they're wrapping things up, or what they're talking about when the takeover is going to be over, and like he comes back and they're like, we built a squash court, and and I think I'm going to take up fishing after this, and things like that. Like these people are fighting for their freedom and their homeland,
lives.
And this guy's just looking over the balcony with the sunset, just like, maybe I'll get a fishing lure next week. Like it's just, oh man, it's craziness.
Yeah, well,
it's part of the I think that it's a really good juxtaposition of Lawrence is in the real war. He's fighting war the way like the Romans did and like the Huns did, where it's up close and personal and brutal. And his colleagues, they're obviously also in the war, but they're fighting an industrial war. And so they kind of still have one foot in, back in the fat country, back in England. Mm-hmm. And Lawrence does not. Lawrence is fully committed. He's a desert guy now. And I think that's one of my favorite elements of the film, is that interplay between those British, where they're, because at that point they're in awe of him, but they also still are, in that squash court conversation, he walks away and then he overhears the guy saying, "Oh, he lays it on a bit thick, doesn't he?"
Right.
And he's still strange to them, and there's something that makes them uncomfortable about him, because he's kind of adopted these sort of really primal, barbaric ways of life.
Right, and he's
warrior ones, not Arab ones. Sorry, to clarify.
Yeah, no, it's definitely in the old school kind of military that he finds himself successful at.
Right,
which is it's helpful. It's strategically helpful to the British Empire, but it's not their goal. Their goal is not to win that way. Yeah. Their goal is to win the battle of resources and sort of like border lines. Is kind of the end goal of everything, and it's very devastating to watch as Lawrence is manipulated and all of his accomplishments are sort of devalued by that.
And he, as he's leaving the country, he literally watches more army people come in, and he's just like, this isn't over. Nothing about this has changed, really.
Yeah, and he breaks himself. He becomes a murderer. At one point, there's when he goes back, there's this amazing shot of where he orders kind of the brutal execution of just an entire sect of the Turkish military, and the sequence is brutal, and Lawrence is just finally unleashing like his most primal self and literally just using the knife to stab people and kill people.
Yeah.
And there's a mirroring shot of him holding the knife upside down, looking at the knife covered in blood at night, and he's horrified. And it obviously echoes the image we saw before of him as the giggling child holding the knife, which is just like
swiping it around, laughing, and
right. And it is really horrifying to watch this man break his own body and sacrifice the lives of hundreds and hundreds of people, probably thousands of people, for seemingly not a lot. Especially because we learn by the end of the film that all of this was just meant as bartering between the two different tribes, between the British Empire and a sort of collective united Arab tribes that all of it boiled down to a collection of resources that they could barter with each other in a room. And that's what he finds out everything was for, including the fact that he basically betrayed Sheriff Ali, who was sort of the only actual moral conscience in the film, which is amazing considering that we meet him literally seeing him murder someone who he thinks is garbage.
Yeah,
and by the end of the film, he's the most morally
he's the one you want to have a beer with.
Because he's the one who's like, oh God, like God help all those Turks. Like that's the point. That's where he's been brought by watching all of these sort of military endeavors that Lawrence partakes in.
Yeah.
And again, the sort of very intimate psychology that David Lean gets into of how all of this sort of makes Lawrence feel and how it feels like a betrayal of all of the sort of potential and love that he felt for the desert, to have it all result in blood on the sand, basically, which is not what he wanted. And to have his body literally be broken, his psyche be broken, and to see that it was for a bunch of sort of British bureaucrats.
Yeah.
I love at the end, there's they're debating over who gets to control the water pumping plant in Damascus.
Yeah.
And Faisal and Allenby, the British general, are debating, and they get interrupted, and then they go back to their debate. And he says, "Where were we?" And a British bureaucrat jumps in to say, "I think we had decided on a British water pumping plant with an Arab flag flying over it." And it is depressing to think that is essentially what they were fighting for, is to have this kind of an Arab puppet state controlled by the British, was the ultimate outcome of all of that blood and all those people ruining their lives.
Yeah, and all this sort of like self-mythologizing that goes along with it, and that, you know, he's really thought that he was leading a revolution to change things.
Yeah.
And that is unfortunately very sidelined by the end of the film, and it's very tragic. And again, it's a really felt film, despite the fact that most people seem to remember this film as like a big spectacle, like an conquering adventure in the desert kind of film. Mm-hmm. And when you really get down to it, the second half of the film, post intermission, the first half of the film, I would say, is kind of that, with hints of something deeper. The second half of the film is like a gradual deflation of that same mythology. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where they build it up to the point where Lawrence is this big hero, and then you watch an hour and a half of just like pure masochistic suffering.
Yeah.
And it actually, and how the film itself gets darker. Like it gets, because the seasons are changing, and it gets darker and colder as kind of they get further from that peak of Lawrence's, heroism, when he's strutting around on that train. From then on out, it's just, every scene's a little darker and a little colder. And then by the time they're in like Syria, when he's about to get captured by the Turks, it's like raining and dark. And then when he leaves Dara and he's finally broken, it's snowing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think we're going to enter the reductive rating round on this one, which for you, Everett, is the part of the show where we remove all the nuance and all the words, and we give the movie a kind of rating between 1 and 5. Half stars are allowed, just for our bookkeeping purposes and our ongoing list of all of the movies that we talked about, roughly sort of like ranked. We also allow sort of like a brief reason why, if you have any more points you want to get in. So I'll go first. For me, Lawrence of Arabia is super easy 5.
Nice. Didn't
even consider it really for like a second. I think that David Lean's filmmaking is amazing. Again, the way that this is somehow manages to be psychologically intimate to Lawrence while not even completely adopting his point of view, for allowing differing points of view to get in, like both the British military, but his Arab superiors and Prince Faisal, his compatriots in Sheriff Ali, who all kind of get moments of contextualization within the film. But at the same time, this is a very distant epic and a giant spectacle that is very thrilling, and you'll get amazing action scenes of scenes like where they take Aqaba, and the scene at night where they raid the Turks, and it's incredibly violent.
The train takeover is
the train takeover with him running along the tops of the train and stuff. It's a completely gorgeously made film, both on an adventure and action level, and also on a character level, as it kind of breaks down the narcissistic sort of mythologizing element of British exceptionalism and British Empire, and kind of watches completely deflates and forces it to suffer right before your eyes as you see sort of the more real world aspects of that infiltrate a cleaner, simplistic dream that we have of heroes and conquering and of history. So yeah, 5.
Sweet. I'm also gonna give it a 5. This blew me away. I can't believe once again they made a desert look so interesting for 3.5 hours.
Oh yeah.
Like some of the most gorgeous cinematography I've ever seen in my life. The score is gorgeous and has been, taken from so many different people now. It's ridiculous. When it comes to any desert score, it seems like they go with kind of these sweeping violins and things like that. And I think that's directly related to this movie. The most fascinating part of this movie was watching Lawrence's character. I didn't know what to expect. I just knew that this was a historical epic. I knew that, it was kind of about an uprising, but I didn't know about his god complex. I didn't know about how eccentric of a character he was. And
how critical it is of him and his god complex,
yeah, exactly.
Which is something that I think a lot of people might not remember about this film if they've seen it a long time ago. I feel like it just, as someone who hadn't seen the film and who had heard a lot about the film, that was the least talked about part of the film. And here I am watching it being like, this is the most interesting part.
I think that's exactly what I'm trying to get at, is that I feel like that's what I would be talking about when I talk to people about it, but I never hear that. So so that was really fascinating, and I'm going to give it the 5. Now, just before, just because I love to know any inaccuracies or anything like that.
You're going to ask that,
Everett.
Was there anything that bothered you?
Is there anything that's really inaccurate to the point where you're like, that's bullshit?
Honestly, no. I mean,
awesome.
The only thing that really nags about me in this movie is, granted, for a 1962 movie, the portrayal of Arabs is very sensitive and generally pretty good.
Yeah.
But there are a couple false notes in there. Anthony Quinn's big-ass fake nose is real weird and makes me uncomfortable every time I see it. The brown face is a little weird.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that over the top on Guinness, but again, if it was today, it's hard to imagine people wouldn't rightfully be wondering why they didn't cast an Arab actor.
Yeah.
Just generally the politics of it. Politically speaking, personally, I'm more of a Gilo Pontecorvo than I am a David Lean. But the history, I mean, it's fiction, obviously, and you should take it as gospel. But I actually think it does give people a very good idea of what was going on in what is in the West, a pretty forgotten part of history, that World War I Middle Eastern theater, totally overshadowed by the trenches and the Bolshevik Revolution and all the drama that happened in Europe during that time. And so I think it's, for something that this is the most people, this is the only thing they know about that period. And I could see a lot worse that could go. So I give it a thumbs up on the history.
Nice.
Sweet.
Nice.
And your rating?
Yeah.
My rating would definitely be a 5 as well. Like I said, there are little false notes, like, again, if anything, probably more just because I'm a lefty and, this is kind of a conservative movie in a lot of ways. But as a piece of art, it's, I think, one of the best pieces of filmmaking out there. Seeing this is what got me interested in film. My parents took me when I was about 9 to go see it on a big screen. And it literally they took me because they couldn't find a babysitter. They were like, whatever, he'll just sleep. Who cares? But I was just riveted the whole time. And that experience of seeing this on the big screen in a theater was what got me into film. So I love it, and I encourage anyone who hasn't seen it to go check it out. There's a lot more going on, as you guys both have said. There's a lot more going on than some hero worship or just kind of a blank adventure film. This is a complex story with great characters, great writing. The score, which we barely talked about, it's like one of the best film scores of all time.
Oh yeah.
It's just everything about it's top notch. I really love this film.
Yeah, and the way that they like crescendo things with certain scenes that are happening, like, those violins are just too damn good.
Oh yeah, yeah. And if we get the chance to see it here in Toronto at 70 millimeter,
oh my God,
I'm gonna do it just to see how magisterial and like bombastic it would be on like, the big screen.
Yeah, for sure.
I would lose it.
Yeah.
The bigger screen, the better, because those desert shots, just like seeing it on the 70 millimeter projection on a real big ass theater screen, that desert just eats up your whole line of sight, and it's really something.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that'll wrap it up for Lawrence of Arabia, and we're going to be right back, and we're going to be talking the Battle of Algiers.
Vous devez en accepter toutes les conséquences nécessaires.
All right, we are talking The Battle of Algiers, the 1966 film directed by, Gilo Pontecorvo? Is that right?
Si.
There we go. There we go. Now, this is a film about the sort of the Algerian struggle under French colonial rule and the National Liberation Front is what it's called, I believe.
Yes.
A group who is fighting to gain the freedom and independence of the Algerian people, as seen from the point of view of a young revolutionary named Ali Lapointe, from sort of his humble beginnings as a lowly petty thief to his rise to prominence in the organization and capture by the French eventually in 1957. The film traces the rebels' struggle and the increasingly extreme measures taken by the French government to quell that revolt. There's your frickin' summary. But largely the film, what's special about this film to me anyway, I watched this for the first time about a year or two ago, and what really kind of blew me away about it was the style. The style is of what this film has going for it. Filmed entirely, almost entirely, with the exception of one actor, with non-professional actors. This film documents the a kind of an oft sort of misrepresented struggle with a kind of on the ground docudrama point of view that really gets you into both the horrifying actions taking place and also the sort of claustrophobic feeling, and makes it feel as realistic as possible by mirroring kind of real life historical footage that you would have maybe seen in the 60s and maybe are familiar with that time period. Yeah, and by crafting an entirely fictional film about a real struggle, he has perhaps created the most honest document of that kind of struggle. So much so to the point that both groups on the sort of revolutionary side and on the oppressive side have both shown to their respective groups as lessons.
That's masterful.
Both
that's amazing.
So both leftist coalitions and Black Panthers and everything who have been fighting for against oppressive states have shown it as how to strategically use terrorism and other aspects to achieve political victory. And at the same time,
Jesus Christ,
the U.S. State Department itself has played this film to show the dangers of losing that battle and what the French did wrong and what they can do to hopefully not do that wrong in the future.
Well, I think both sides need to holy shit, that's fucking crazy.
So that's just it, is that's just how what feels like truthful and honest and historical about this film is that you can have two groups of people looking at the film and being and looking at the strategies of it and being like, we can apply this or learn from this.
Yeah.
which is not something that you would expect, especially just coming off a film that is also about a political uprising and a revolution in Lawrence of Arabia,
right,
which is obviously very more character centric and not as interested. It's interested in a more filmic entertainment that also
feels much more of an adventure than
thrills on like on a human level, but not necessarily trying to do something that feels as sort of starkly, I don't want to say gross, that doesn't feel like the wrong word, but something just so on a grit level with people who are suffering and people who are a lot of the time perpetrating that suffering.
This actually gets to what I think is probably the most interesting contrast between these two movies, which is, I think the difference in approach that you just laid out tells you a lot about the politics of the people who made these films. So Lawrence of Arabia, the center of the action is the character, the individual, what's going on with these people's psychologies, what actions do they take. That's what drives the action of the film.
It's like a humanist story inside of a political backdrop.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so that's, to me, that's kind of, in the broadest possible sense of the word, that's a very liberal viewpoint. And Gilo Pontecorvo was not a liberal. He was a communist. Don't quote me on that. He might be a socialist rather than a communist. But
I think he's since been like, call me whatever, is a dude who has left beliefs and wants people to live well.
A Marx-influenced left-wing person. But to him, that's not what Marxism is about. That's about the collective and the people. And I think a lot of the difference in approach is explained by the fact that Pontecorvo is trying to kind of turn the people and the system and kind of the broader geopolitical ferment into part of the movie. That's what drives the action. Even the when we're following the stuff Ali Lapointe does, which is a very kind of traditional like thriller stuff. That's that they explicitly say that they're doing this to inspire the people. And it's all about people watching, and there's a lot of shots of people's eyes as they watch things happen.
Mm-hmm. Lots of close-ups of faces that like it's just, and they're so stark because the rest of the film is not like that. Those are probably the most sort of like old school filmmaking stuff that he sort of implements, because you're watching what feels like historical footage a lot of the time,
a lot of it
and
is
then you'll have a sudden close-up of someone's very human face.
Because a lot of it's just big wide shots that feel like he's just documenting. There's no real narrative to what he's showing. It just feels like it's happening.
It's
like it's just life. Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I love that feel of this movie, the kind of documentary style. It feels. It makes. I mean, it's a cliche, but it does make the history come alive. Like you can feel like you're watching a true documentary when you're watching a film. It's pretty incredible.
And I think that gets to the heart of a lot of that. That '60s sort of leftist, nationalist, anti-colonial wave of rebellions. There's that whole ideology is steeped in that idea of you act, the revolutionaries act, and then their actions inspire the people to action, because and create solidarity and create unity, and those eye shots and those reaction shots are what's drawing that connection in the film that exists in the ideology.
Right, because we have to point out that a big thing that he does here is he doesn't shy away from the brutality being sort of perpetrated both by the French and the ones that the Algerians have kind of accepted as a machination. That they have been like, look, a violent revolution is the only thing that is going to actually fix our political problems. And he traces that from, as you've said, as a sort of tool, that it's used as a broader machination to inspire a larger group of people. And at the same time, the characters are wrestling with that, as in there's an incredible sequence in this film where three ladies have to go out and they are instructed to go and bomb.
I was actually actually just going to mention
French
this.
civilian centers. And up until this point in the film, this is about 40 minutes into the film, I think.
Yeah.
Up until this point in the film, the French are very, very specifically by Pontecorvo not humanized. He is very clearly
they're painted as the army and just militants
Exactly. He is specifically showing you the very human reality and faces of the Algerian people in suffering. There's an amazing close-up of Ali that it freeze frames out of that kind of gets us into the main crux of the film.
Yeah.
And it's phenomenally made to watch this. And then this is the first time in the film, while these ladies are carrying bombs in their bags to go take over to the French side, where we see the first glimpse of those same shots being used on French civilians and French citizens, where and again, what's so fascinating about this is that normally a worse filmmaker anyway would frame this just for simple hypocrisy. He would say, oh, well, both sides are equally violent, so therefore this is all bad. But more what he actually is doing is he's showing you that this is a much thornier acceptance that they are about to commit some fucking horrifying acts.
Gonna kill children.
As a political act. And that they are accepting the consequences of that, which is horrifying to think about. And then at the same time, you're watching it and you're being like, this is kind of like what actually happens in the world.
He kind of makes you feel just like they would have to feel in a way.
It's completely. They're making a decision. It's like ripping your heart apart to watch it because you're like, obviously,
like that 5-year-old at the restaurant does not deserve what he's about to go through.
Exactly, and you see close-ups of them like dancing and eating ice cream and all of this.
They're just being people.
Exactly,
they have no
And this is.
But I would say actually that's an important distinction because there are a lot of similarities to the way he films. Because right before that, there's the sequence where the French civilians bomb an Algerian apartment building.
Yes.
And there's differences in the way he frames that are very significant, which, first of all, the Algerians, as you guys have talked about, they're depicted as, suffering and sad. The French, as we see them when they're about to get blown up, they're complacent. They're happy. They're having a good time. They seem to have you would get no sense that there's a war going on their doorstep.
Right. And then it's the thing that the Algerians want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the aftermath is depicted the same. They even use the same music, which I think is a great touch for the aftermath of both bombings. But then the next shot after you see that the horrible carnage of the bombing is another cheering crowd of French colonists. And they're cheering because the paratroopers have come. And it's the beginning of the crackdown. And so it does give you, while they are showing you some of the equivalence between these two scenes, they're not the same. And I think you're right that he's very good about not just making this kind of trite point about, in war, everyone suffers.
Right, because he is documenting in the way that he is documenting as a situation. He's showing you that there is a difference in power that is forcing one group to suffer a lot more than the other. But he's also not ignoring the fact that there is a whole lot of carnage happening here, and it fucking sucks. And it's really fascinating to see that struggle documented on film and to make you feel that way, because a lot of films about these subjects are not as complicated and thorny as that in their depiction of these things. Most people want a more simplistic... They just have the
protagonist and the antagonist.
Exactly.
And that's it.
Yeah, they want a more simplistic reading of history, and unfortunately that's not a lot of the way that it plays out.
Yeah, almost ever.
This film actually originally was that. This was developed by the Algerian government in its early stages to be basically like, we're a new country. We want a founding epic about our glorious struggle for independence. And they approached Pontecorvo because he was a lefty. He'd been supportive of the cause. He was a great director. He made political films, and they figured, hey, he'll shoot this propaganda movie we wrote. And basically he was like, I'll do this, but I want to do it my way. And he managed to convince them, which is frankly pretty amazing, that basically if you want to do really effective propaganda, you can't just do some ham-handed good guy, bad guy thing. You want to actually show, because you guys are in the right, Pontecorvo would have said, and I frankly agree, show what really happened, how it happened. And they somehow managed to convince a government to adopt that, which is... Governments generally don't like depicting things as they were. There's not a lot of spin in this movie, which is really remarkable, given that the guy, the co-writer of this, is an actual ex-FLN militant who was part of all these events.
Wow. That's insane.
So you can expect that a lot of this on the ground stuff, especially the machinations of how that group worked, and especially the bit they kind of really thrillingly lay out how that organization works, where each member only knows 2 other people in the group: the person that set him up, the person who got him, and then the person who he recruited is kind of how it works or whatever. Or they know 3 maybe, the 2 that he recruited, and everybody just kind of goes.
An easier
from
way
there.
to keep track, I think. Like
what I love about that scene, the French colonel is laying that out,
and he's the only
How does
actor
he know
in the
that?
film, the French colonel.
Right? Yeah, Jean Martin.
Yeah.
He's laying that all out. How does he know that? It's not from intelligence. It's because he was in the resistance. He's done what they did, so he knows the game. And that's a very weird, backdrop to this whole story. Algeria was legally part of France, and so this is France in 1954, 9 years after the Germans left. So all of these people in this movie, the French soldiers, well, officers anyway, are veterans of people who've been fighting fascism before this. And it's a very odd wrinkle to all those French colonial wars that these guys had been on the in the other position not so long ago.
Yeah, so they know the strategies and they know how to quash them. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in here, and I think Pontecorvo also manages to make this just really thrilling to watch in general. The Morricone score helps a lot.
Yeah,
which is phenomenal, and the sound design of the drumming and the sort of the machinery that's involved in this. There's a lot of engine noises and gunfire and
loudspeakers and helicopters, and I made note of that. But as the movie goes on and the French kind of gain the upper hand, those machine noises are more and more prevalent to the point where when they're right at the end and the last of them are getting run down, there's always a helicopter overhead. There's always a loudspeaker in the background because it's just that omnipotent kind of power building in the background. I really like how they do that.
Were there any scenes in this movie or just shots in general that were actual documentation of any event?
I don't think so.
Okay,
no,
there
and
were
they
certain
actually had
things
to
by the end that I was like, "Holy hell, this looks legitimately real." It was crazy.
Well, yeah, that's what's wild.
The theatrical cut of this actually has a disclaimer saying none of this is newsreel footage because people would watch it and just assume it was documentary largely.
Wow, that's so amazing. Wow.
Yeah, it would be the best documentary I've ever seen.
Yeah,
where you get
they got in gritty there.
You get these amazingly well organized filmic representation of targeted assassinations. You're just
how did they get the camera where the restaurant blew up?
Some of the stuff, especially some of the bit players, when they just show a montage of assassinations, some of those, the actors were guys who had assassinated French police officers. The guy at the beginning in the prison who gets executed, that guy had been sentenced to death for FLN activities. And he got clemency, obviously, because he was in the movie. But so he literally had been in that exact position where he's shouting "Long live Algeria" as they're leading him to the guillotine. That guy, that's an actual, convicted terrorist death row prisoner who they did that with.
Wow, that's
in the
insane.
prison where it happened. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's kind of crazy. Yeah, the film kind of just largely gets that sort of this escalating violence and the increasingly the French occupation escalates obviously as that's going on, and we talked about how the sound design gets into that, and there's all kinds of hilarious things that they start because it turns into a bit of a propaganda war at that point where they're like, the FLN wants to stop you from working. And starve you and condemn you to poverty, and all of this. They're like, the army is protecting you, trust in it, and all of this. And meanwhile, a little kid somehow gets the army is portrayed a little bit inept in this too, where the little kid gets control of the monitor, and he's just like, keep going, guys, we're gonna do it.
Yeah, for
and
real.
all the army dudes are running around being like, how the hell is this happening?
That actually is one of the only real political criticisms I have of this movie. Is there actually were a lot of Arabs who supported the French. They're French people don't talk about it today, but what started the whole Arab immigration wave to France was people who had fought for the French in this war, who, when they got independence, were like, we're not going to stick around and get revenge killed by the people we were brutalizing. You got to bring us to France. And so they brought like almost 1 million, I believe, Algerians who had fought in the French army in this conflict over. But that was a line that the Algerian government, when they made this film, was not going to cross. We're not going to let you show collaborators, because as you, I'm sure, picked up on, the national unity of the Algerian people is a major theme here. And saying, oh, by the way, there were also 1 million who fought for the French is not part of that. That would have been
really fascinating.
Yeah, Pontecorvo, man.
That would have
done it.
This
it's
movie's
great
amazing,
regardless.
but that really would have
made it even
added,
thornier.
Yeah, I would have loved that.
But then the film probably would have needed to be a little bit longer and would have needed to address the fact that
another half hour.
Just because this specifically addresses like a 3 or 4 year period, right?
Yeah.
And then you would have had to talk about, contextualize the Algerian, how the French colonization of Algeria in the first place, and all of this, and it would have been a much bigger of a film. We would have needed a Lawrence of Arabia
it would have been another Lawrence,
epic.
But that is really interesting,
because this is what's going on in Algiers. And there's a whole other war out in the mountains, which they mention a couple times, which looks more like America in Vietnam, with kind of guerrillas and then the little mobile bands trying to chase them down.
Yeah, that would have been.
There's a very good French movie from I think 4 years ago about that does get into the quote unquote Algerian loyalists, and then which one of them are not so loyal. But that's just, that's a different story and beyond what they were going to tell with that, actually bringing all those cameras out into the mountains and trying to depict that would have been a very different undertaking to try to maintain that realist style out in the wilderness. I don't think they probably could have.
Well,
that's a good point.
They even have a line kind of closer to the end of the film when they have the French have what they felt like anyway. They have squashed the literal FLN, where they have taken out the heads of the group. They have taken out Ali and his two higher ups.
Is this when they do that brilliant little sequence where they start, like, they begin the film within the wall, and then by the end it comes full circle and they're in the wall
it all kind of comes full circle because
I really
they killed one of his higher ups, and then the second higher up did end up bowing to the French, or at least him and his wife end up kind of getting a ride. They see it as a sort of a pointless gesture to just die in a house like that.
Right.
But Ali, who was very committed to the cause, and same with Ali's, I guess, his friends and family who are with him there, who are all committed to the cause, do end up doing what is dictated by Ali's higher up, a pointless gesture. And it's very heavily hinted by Pontecorvo that gesture is kind of like the final nail in the coffin for the inspiration for the people, because it's just such a raw expression of how necessary that uprising is for the people and for getting out of their suffering conditions. And it actually reminded me of a film that I watched a couple weeks ago. It's an old Robert Redford movie that no one has seen called Tell Them Willy Boy Is Here. Okay. But it takes on a very similar ending in that Redford, who is kind of a sheriff, an officer of the old cowboy law, is hunting down a young native boy who did murder someone. He murdered someone in self-defense, but because he thinks he's not going to get a fair trial, he books it, and Robert Redford spends the whole film chasing after him. It's a back and forth, but what kind of happens that's amazingly dark for a 60s film even is the sort of the native kid's ultimate decision is to point his gun at Robert Redford and get shot with it empty, because he was like, I would rather fucking die than go in with you, because that trial is going to be worse than you just fucking killing me right now.
Oh, okay.
Because it was true, because all the people following behind Redford, just minutes behind him, were ready to lynch the kid.
Right.
For what he did.
And I think you're...
What's that?
Go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say that the big thing that happens for Redford's character in that moment is he is exposed to, holy shit, maybe people are treated differently in different power systems. As it totally breaks his brain, this idea that kid who has completely expressed with his entire body that is it's a political expression he almost can't comprehend. And that is kind of the exact same thing that Ali does here, that everyone's kind of shocked by, because they're like, dude, this is pointless. Just come on in. You don't need to do this. He does it, and that is kind of what kind of pushes the final nail in the coffin, even as the sort of the French are walking away and going, you know what? we'll settle for Algiers. We don't need Algeria.
yeah.
That scene, they do a really good visual callback to explain to you what's happening there, which is, if you remember when Ali blows himself up, he's kind of down at the base of a hill, and there's people, Algerians, up watching from their rooftops, looking down at the building he's in as the French are about to blow it up. And it calls back to, if you remember the very beginning of the movie, when Ali is convinced to join the FLN, he's in prison, and he watches that FLN guy, just totally defiant to the very end before he gets executed. And he's like, wow, that seems like something I could be into. And if you remember that scene, there's all these, you see the eyes of all the prisoners looking down, watching him being executed.
Yeah.
And it's the same phenomenon where it's the guy sacrificing himself. And it's not about the guy. It's all the eyes watching, because all those people who see that sacrifice are convinced of his cause. And that kind of gets right to the heart of what I think Pontecorvo is trying to express here, which is that these sort of militant groups like the FLN, that's their role, which is a big part of that like lefty 60s liberation ideology, which, it's this kind of small group of righteous people sort of with their bravery standing up to the state, inspiring the people. And that shot kind of
willing
draws
to literally
that
sacrifice their bodies for it, which is kind of like the big thing.
And Ali, one thing I wanted to talk about is that that transition he makes from being a small time. At the beginning, there's all those they read out all those official documents rather than doing narration, which I love. And they read his rap sheet at the beginning when they introduce him, and just basically this guy's a loser. He's a petty criminal and guy who can't hold a job. And then by the end, he's one of the leaders of this group. And that's another big part of that ideology, is this idea that sort of, if you're a loser, if you are, if there's something wrong with your life and you're a member of a colonialized nation, it's because of colonialism. And that struggle against colonialism will kind of purify you and improve you as a human being. Like if people have read Frantz Fanon, it's a lot of that.
I have not.
But it's, again,
this is what you're here for.
It's another, I think it's interesting to look at this and see, that people say you can't make good art that's ideological, and this movie is highly ideological, but it's also a brilliant work of art. And I think it's interesting to look at it in that perspective and see Pontecorvo putting in this kind of doctrinaire 60s communist view, and putting it on the screen in a way that's compelling.
Well, and putting it in that, specifically in that Italian neorealist style aesthetic, which is just completely gorgeous to watch. And again, the way it replicates that like on the ground experience in that kind of conflict and in that kind of, that psychological and bodily state, which is honestly, it's the first time I watched it, it was kind of difficult to watch for me, just because I was like, it's a very claustrophobic film, and not in the way that you would normally expect, because this isn't like an overcut film. This isn't filled with tons of shots that are like trapping you. This is kind of just like it's so real, it's uncomfortable.
You feel trapped in the boundaries of the city that they're in with these characters. You really do. You feel like there's no escape. You feel these roadblocks are surrounding you at all times. Like, you feel the takeover of the French.
Absolutely.
I think it's, they put up those roadblocks at the beginning, and they really, that's kind of such a recurring thing in the movie, both just like literally as the plot, like how do we get around the French roadblocks? But then they also do a very good job of giving you that kind of locked up feel. It's almost like a maze, a lot of those shots in the Kasbah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we might enter the reductive rating round on this one. But for me, Battle of Algiers was my second go at it. 5.
Nice.
It's phenomenal for basically all the reasons that we've said, man. Like I can't, like, again, that neo-realist docudrama style can't be understated. I guess that is, I almost can't imagine this film working without how much Pontecorvo's filmmaking like really lends to it. Again, if they didn't get him, we wouldn't be talking about this movie. Especially the way that clearly the Algerian government wanted to make it. But yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal, and an amazing document of a particular struggle and a particular time funneled through an amazingly thrilling and evocative aesthetic. And again, Morricone's score during a lot of the sort of like a lot of the raid sequences and a lot of the more suspense based sequences. Is nail biting. I was going crazy. And again, the way that this manages to take a very sort of complex history and both observe it in a way that gets at the brutal elements of it, but also keeps in mind the differing power levels that are happening on here, and that there is something more brutal in the sort of larger systemic clinical sense of the French colonists in relation to, you know, the National Liberation Front and the Algerian people who are suffering. Literally, they are suffering so that other people aren't. And I think that this film documents that and also gets at the fact that this was one fucking messy armed conflict, and Pontecorvo wants you to experience it in an on-the-ground, horrifying experience. And yeah, I think he does all of that somehow, and probably one of the only films I've ever seen be able to do that well.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, it's also a 5. For me, I think it's honestly the best portrayal of this kind of, you know, on the ground, almost, you called it neo-realism?
Neo-realism is what the Italian movement was called, of a kind of like the start, this more like stark black and white films that are more made for low budget with non-professional actors with
on location
that was very interested in the sort of the experience of poverty and the experience of suffering and oppression in a larger sense of people kind of forgotten by history.
Right. Yeah, my brother was actually talking to me about it because he did an essay on this particular film, and he mentioned the neo-realism and this kind of this feeling that it gives you of a documentary in a way, and I just didn't know what to expect, and I couldn't believe how realistic this felt. I just felt like I was watching a history book in a way, but it was still fascinating. I mean, the filmmaking still makes it very interesting. It's amazing to me that there's almost no actors or real actors in this movie. I mean, everyone pulls off a great performance.
Yeah, and the one that there is kind of a showman character anyway, so it actually does work for him.
Yeah, it works. It works on all levels.
Now, Jamie, I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's a movie that, based on this, maybe we'll recommend it to everyone. It's called Army of Shadows.
That sounds very familiar.
It's a French World War II film by Jean-Pierre Melville, who at the time
that name,
in France, he was kind of like known as a crime/gangster movie filmmaker.
Okay.
And he applies that kind of style to a World War II picture. Whew. And again, with that, so like imagine like a gangster tragedy, but about
so he adds
a bunch
the
of
neo-realism to World War II. Like what is?
It's a little less neo-realist because it's more stylish. Okay. It's got like a gangster, smooth criminal style to it. Okay. But it does that sort of like gangster tragedy style thing about a bunch of political resistance fighters who are opposing Nazi occupation in France.
Oh, okay.
And
that sounds awesome.
It's the closest thing I can say to Battle of Algiers, to something that wanted to apply a style you wouldn't associate with history or with war films to that, and finds kind of a very harrowing emotional experience out of that.
Okay.
But yeah, it's phenomenal.
That's awesome. I'll have to check it out. But yeah, I'm going to give Battle of Algiers a 5. I was blown away by this movie, so yeah.
Awesome. Everett, for you.
I mean, probably obvious by now. I also give it a 5. Yeah, this is just this is one of my favorite movies of all time. You know, it's so much going. It's a heady movie in a lot of ways. It's almost like a Ken Loach movie in some scenes, where it's this didactic dialogue, but it's exciting to watch, and it's got action, and it's got this broad scope. There's really nothing else exactly like it that I can think of. It's just, you know, if anything in kind of this historical political realm interests you, you will find this movie riveting. It's got so much going on. It's fun to watch. You know, we probably made it sound like it's some kind of intellectual treatise, but it's exciting. It's gritty. It's an action movie in parts.
It does get under your skin in a way that's like kind of like this isn't a like I honestly I can't really like look away from this film.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you're never bored watching this film. Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just it's a really and obviously the very strange circumstances.
This is where we're getting the genre element from.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I was just going to say, exactly. All
the thrilling depiction of assassinations and
that's where it gets sleazy.
And the more the more suspenseful sequences of people hiding and of people trying to get through checkpoints. There are parts of this movie that feel real sleazy.
I mean, there's some dirt in here. There's some real. And there's some stuff that, is almost, if you just saw one scene, you might think it was some exploitation movie because it gets kind of gory in parts. I mean, some of those torture sequences, those actually were cut in some countries when it was first released because it was too much.
Oh, wow.
Also worth mentioning, this movie was not shown in France until 1971.
Oh, yeah. They're like, we're not going to get that one. Not going to buy that one.
It was banned for 5 years, even though it was playing film festivals and such.
I'm sure a lot of people were talking about it. Was it a big film when it came out? At least amongst the film circles?
It was pretty well respected, and it played the Venice Film Festival. It might have even won the Venice Film Festival.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure.
That's awesome.
And that's,
I believe it won the Venice Film Festival, yeah.
Yeah. But just between Pontecorvo and Morricone were enough to, I think, get people's respect on it.
Yeah.
And then the fact that it blew, I imagine it blew minds because, again, imagine that you associated this kind of footage with what you watched on TV. Like, imagine you're on the TV, you're at home, you're watching, like, civil rights footage.
Right. That's what it looks like.
And then you're like, all right, I'm going to go escape from that. I'm going to take a night at the movies.
Oh, Battle of Algiers. Let's check it out.
And you're like, holy crap, this is even worse.
Is this happening? Yeah.
All right.
Well, something to remember too is in France, the Algeria kind of took over France. Like that issue, that event kind of dominated France in the late 50s, the way Vietnam dominated America.
Well, yeah, they even mentioned at the end of the film, right?
Brought on the government. Yeah, I mean, the French commander, who we unfortunately didn't talk enough about, he's a great character. He's a composite of a couple different guys. And those guys attempted a coup shortly after these events, and the French government went away. Like the current French government is the Fifth Republic, and that's because it's number 5 because they got rid of the old one and brought in the new one with de Gaulle because the country was so divided over what was going on in Algeria that the entire system collapsed, and they had to bring in the one guy in the entire country who had the gravitas to unite the country. So this was, I think that's one thing we miss not seeing it in its original context is just what a massive issue that was in, very recent memory when this came out.
Well, yeah, because I was going to say that they kind of mention at the end of the film that the sort of exposure that all this violence kind of brought on was enough that the French people were like, what the fuck are we doing to the Algerians? That all of those people who were kind of living blissfully are all of a sudden more aware of the actual issue that's taking place, which is briefly touched upon in the film, but it sounds like is very historically important to what actually happened post all of this.
Yeah.
Especially because this came out so shortly after. Again, we're
4
talking
years.
Yeah,
something?
Because the events depicted in the film, I think, go to 58 or 59, and this came out in 66.
Right, yeah, okay.
So a lot of people would have just watched this. This is like if we saw like to be fair, I guess we kind of do that all the time now. But shit, when did Michael May make his Benghazi movie?
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's going to wrap it up for Battle of Algiers. That would have been both Battle of Algiers and Lawrence of Arabia on this week's show. Thanks so much, Everett, for coming on and bringing on these really meaty films to talk about.
Yeah, that was awesome.
This is
that was really fun. I really enjoyed it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, this is the part of the show, Everett, where if you've got anything to plug, do it here. And I think you do.
I do, yes. If any of this history stuff is interesting to you, I have a podcast about Napoleon Bonaparte who, talk about Lawrence with a kind of monstrous / amazing / very noble, very interesting character. Another guy who was kind of like that is Napoleon Bonaparte. That's called The Age of Napoleon. You can find that if you're listening to this, you probably know how to find podcasts. Again, that's The Age of Napoleon. And I'm on Twitter as Trillburn. That's not as much fun though. And that's about it.
Awesome.
Yeah, everyone check out Age of Napoleon, where we get into just literal history. No fictionalized take by filmmakers.
Yeah, none of that bull.
Oh yeah. But for patrons, you guys are going to hear from us in 1 week time. And what are we talking? We are talking George A. Romero.
Yeah.
Entirely. We are talking Night of the Living Dead, his original, I believe that's 1968 feature, the film that basically invented what we now know as the zombie feature.
Right.
And then we're going to be pairing it with his 1973 vague follow-up, The Crazies.
Yeah, which are very similar themes, but just dives
what's
a little
interesting,
more
and we'll get
into
into it when we actually get into that episode, I think, is The Crazies kind of picks up where the end of Night of the Living Dead kind of left off.
Yeah, a little bit.
Which is more, whereas Night of the Living Dead is kind of invested in a more individual experience. The Crazies is more invested in the general ineptitude of the systemic reaction to emergency situations.
Yeah.
But either way, those films are going to be a lot of fun to talk about, and they are welcoming us into Spooktober.
Yes.
Which is going to be an entire horror-filled October. Not that we don't talk about horror anyway, so it's fine. But the month of October on this show is going to be entirely dedicated to horror films. So we're going to kick it off with George A. Romero, and then... so again, that's going to be on patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast in 1 week's time. And in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be back with a guest for everyone, for free listeners, for everyone. And we're going to be talking another filmmaker, Juan Picur Simone. Holy crap, that's probably wrong. I'm guessing he's French. But either way, he is an exploitation filmmaker. We're getting deep into the exploitation on that one. We're going to be talking Pieces, 1982, which from what I understand is kind of a Texas Chainsaw Massacre ripoff. Cool. But maybe even gets a little more absurd and gritty.
All right.
Which, I mean,
really?
I don't know how, but that's what I've heard. And then we're going to be pairing it with the same filmmaker, Juan. 1988, he did a movie called Slugs, which I also haven't seen. But from
is it more like a body horror kind of thing?
From what I understand, it sounds like Street Trash, but instead of turning into slime, they turn into slugs.
I'm down.
So that's what we're going to be talking about for everyone in 2 weeks' time. But that'll just about wrap it up for us. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. And keep it sleazy.
Keep it sleazy.